Awakening. As delirium was the dream of people in a waking state, it was necessary to jolt the delirious out of their semi-sleep and tear them from the dreamy wakefulness, where images were all, that they might return to a genuine awakening, where the images of sleep would disappear before the figures of perception. This absolute awakening, which dispatches the various forms of illusion one after another, was what Descartes had sought at the beginning of his meditations, and which he had found, paradoxically, in the consciousness of dream, in the consciousness that consciousness was deceived. But in the case of the mad, it was up to medicine to operate the awakening, transforming the solitude of Cartesian courage into the authoritative intervention by a waking person sure of his or her wakefulness into the deceived wakefulness of the lunatic. This was a shortcut that dogmatically cut through Descartes' long path to certainty. What Descartes discovered at the end of his resolution and in the redoubling of a consciousness that neither separates from itself nor splits, medicine in fact imposed from the outside in the disassociation between doctor and patient. The doctor, in relation to the madman, reproduced the moment of the cogito with relation to dreams, illusion, and madness, a cogito from the outside, foreign to cognition itself, which could only impose itself on consciousness in the form of an eruption. The structure of the eruption of wakefulness is one of the most constant forms in all of the therapeutics of madness. Occasionally, it takes on extremely simple aspects, simultaneously those most highly charged with images and those most credited with immediate powers. Thus, it was accepted that the sound of a rifle shot fired close by had cured a young girl of convulsions she suffered as the result of a violent sadness. Without going quite as far as that imaginary realization of methods of awakening, sudden, intense emotions might obtain a similar result. It was in that spirit that Boerhaave brought about a famous cure for sufferers from convulsions in Haarlem. An epidemic of the disease had spread through the city hospital, and high doses of antispasmodic drugs had failed to have any effect. Boerhaave ordered that stoves with burning coals be brought in, and that iron hooks of a certain shape be heated in them. Stoves filled with burning coals be brought in, and that iron hooks of a certain shape should be heated in them. He then announced that as all other methods to cure the seizures had failed, he had only one remedy left at his disposal, which was to burn to the bone a certain spot on the arm of any man, woman, or child who suffered a convulsion. A slower method, but one more certain of the truth onto which it opened, was the awakening to wisdom, and its insistent imperative passage through the landscape of madness. It was to that wisdom, in all its different forms, that Willis turned to cure madness. Imbeciles needed pedagogic wisdom, an assiduous and diligent master to gradually introduce them to all that children learnt in school. Melancholics were to be treated with a form of wisdom that took as its model the most rigorous and evident form of truth, so that the imaginary component of their delirium evaporated in the light of incontestable truth. In their case, mathematical or chimical studies were recommended. Others were to be cured with the wisdom of a well-ordered life, which would reduce their delirium. There was no need to impose any other than that of their daily life. They should take care of their household affairs and govern their family. They should build houses, plant and order gardens, orchards, and till the grounds. Maniacs, on the other hand, needed the rigor of the social order imposed from the outside, by force if necessary, to bring their minds progressively back to the light of truth. For the madman being placed in a house convenient for the business must be so handled both by the physician and so by the servants that are prudent, that he may be in some manner kept in, either by warnings, chidings, or punishments afflicted upon him to his body or his behavior or manners. Little by little, in the course of the classical age, this authoritarian awakening from madness was to lose its original meaning and become nothing more than a reminder of the moral law, a return to order and fidelity to the law. What Willis still understood as a reopening of the self to truth was no longer entirely comprehensible to savages, who spoke of lucidity in the recognition of the good. In this way, people who have lost their reason due to erroneous principles of moral philosophy can be recalled to their senses, providing they agree to examine the true principles of the good with us, which are the ones to be preferred above the rest. It was thus not so much as an awakening that a physician was to act, but more as a moralist against madness. Tissot noted that a pure conscience beyond reproach is an excellent safeguard. Before long, Pinel would believe that an awakening to reason had no meaning in the cure, and that what was required was obedience and blind submission. A fundamental principle for the cure of mania in a great number of cases is to first have recourse to energetic repression and to make sure that benevolent methods only ever follow such a treatment. Theatrical realization. In appearance, at least, this technique seems rigorously opposed to the idea of an awakening, where the vivid reality of a delirium was brought up against the patient work of reason. Reason imposed itself either through a slow form of pedagogy or as an authoritarian invasion, as though imposing the weight of its own being. The non-being of madness, the inanity of error, were ultimately forced to crack under the pressure of this truth. Here, the therapeutic operation was entirely placed in the space of the imagination, where unreality was complicit with itself. The imaginary had to enter into its own game, willingly calling up new images, matching the delirium on its own term, without opposition or confrontation, without even a visible dialectic, paradoxically bringing a cure. Health was to invest the sickness and destroy it in the midst of the nothingness in which it was contained. Imagination, when sick, can only be cured by the effects of another healthy, properly employed imagination. It matters little whether that cure is effected by fear, by a vivid or painful impression on the senses, or by an illusion. Illusions could cure the illusory, whereas only reason could liberate the self from unreason. What then was this troubling power that the imaginary possessed? The essence of an image is that it should be taken for reality, and equally reality can ape the image and pass itself off as having the same substance and meaning. Without disturbance or rupture, perception can continue the dream and fill in the gaps, bringing confirmation to all that is precarious in it and allowing it to accomplish its work. If illusions could appear as real as perception, then perception too could pass itself off as the truth, undeniable and visible, of the illusion. The first moment in the cure by theatrical realization was therefore the integration of the unreality of the image into the perceptive truth, without perception appearing to contradict or even contest the importance of the image. Lusitanus recounts in this fashion the cure of a melancholic who believed himself to be already damned on the account of the enormity of his sins. As there was no means of convincing him by reasonable argument that he might yet be saved, his delirium was accepted, and an angel dressed in white was made to appear, sword in hand, announcing, after a severe exhortation, the remission of his sins. That example also demonstrates the second moment of the cure. Realization within the image was not sufficient. It was also necessary to continue the delirious discourse. For in the senseless speech of the patient there was a voice that spoke, obeying its own grammar and bringing a meaning. Grammar and meaning had to be maintained in such fashion that the realization of the fantasy and reality did not seem to involve any change of register or the transposition into a new language with a modification in meaning. The same language should continue to be understood, bringing one new deductive element to the rigor of its discourse. That element was anything but indifferent. The idea was not simply to prolong the delirium, but to continue it until it was accomplished. It was to be led towards some form of paroxysm and crisis, where, with no intrusion from the outside, it would be confronted with itself and forced into a debate with the requirements of its own truth. The real and perception-based discourse that prolonged the delirious and image-based discourse was therefore neither to escape the laws of the delirium nor leave their sovereignty, but to exert some sort of positive function within them. It concentrated the delirium on its essential element, and while it took the risk of confirming it, it did that with a view of dramatizing it to a useful end. One example quoted was the case of a patient who believed himself to be dead, and who was genuinely dying by starving himself to death. A troop of people, pale and dressed like the dead, entered his room, set up a table, brought food and drink, and sat down to eat. The dying man, who was ravenous, looked on, and the dead expressed surprise that he was not eating, and convinced him that they ate just as much as the living. He quickly became accustomed to the idea. Inside an unbroken discourse, the elements of the delirium enter into contradiction, leading to the crisis. That crisis is ambiguously medical and theatrical. For a few years here, the tradition of Western medicine, which went all the way back to Hippocrates, was suddenly in step with one of the major forms of theatrical experience. What suddenly shaped the horizon was the theme of a great crisis that would confront the lunatic with his own insanity, reason with unreason, the lucid ruses of man with the blindness of the madman, a crisis that marked the point where illusion turned back on itself, opened itself to the blinding nature of the truth. That opening is imminent in the crisis, and its immediate proximity is an essential component. but it is not produced by the crisis itself. For the crisis to be medical and not simply dramatic, and for it not to be a simple annihilation of the man, but rather the suppression of the illness, guaranteeing that the dramatic realization of the delirium should have the effect of a comic purification, it was vital that the ruse be introduced at the correct moment. A ruse, or at least an element that subtly altered the autonomous game of the delirium, and which, while continuing to confirm it, binding it to its own truth, nonetheless only did so by tying it to the necessity of its own suppression. The simplest example of the method was the ruse employed with delirious patients who imagined that their body contained an object or an extraordinary animal. When a patient believes that he has a living animal trapped inside him, you must pretend to extract it. If it is in the belly, a violent purgative should have the desired effect, as you can feign the expulsion of the animal into a waiting vessel without the patient being aware of the subterfuge. Acting out made the delirious object real, but at the same time exterior, and if it made it perceptible to the senses of the sufferer, it forcefully delivered him from it. The artificial reconstruction of the delirium constituted the real trajectory through which the patient was to recover his liberty. Sometimes there was no need for this distancing effect. On occasion it was within the quasi-perception of the delirium that a perceptive element came to take its place, silently at first, but progressively, so that its slow affirmation gradually came to contest the whole system. It was then within the self and within the perception that confirmed the delirium that the patient saw the liberating reality. Dralion wrote of how a physician cured a melancholic who imagined that he no longer had a head, but sort of a void in its place. The doctor entered into the delirium with the patient and agreed to the patient's demand that he stopped up the hole by placing a large lead ball on his head. Soon the discomfort that quickly resulted from the painful weight was enough to convince the patient that he did indeed have a head. Finally, the ruse and its function of comic reduction could be assured with the complicity of the doctor, but without any direct intervention on his part, through the spontaneous action of the organism of the patient. In the case quoted above of the melancholic, who was really dying as he had lost the desire to eat on account of his beliefs that he was already dead, the theatrical production of the meal of the dead was sufficient incentive for him to eat again. The food restored his strength, the use of food calmed him down, and the organic problem disappeared. The delirium, which was both the cause and the effect of it, also vanished. The real death that would have resulted from the imaginary death was brushed aside by reality through the very enactment of unreal death. An exchange of non-being with itself was carried out in a cunning fashion. The non-being of delirium was transferred to the real being of sickness, and suppressed it by the fact of the expulsion of the delirium through the theatrical enactment. That coming into being of the non-being of delirium effaced it as non-being, and that by the pure mechanisms of its internal contradiction, a mechanism that is at once a game of words and a game within the deception, language game and games within the image. Delirium is suppressed, and non-being is that it is perceived, but as the being of a delirium rests entirely in its non-being, it is suppressed as delirium altogether. Its confirmation in the fantastical theater restores it to a truth which, by ensnaring it in reality, drives it out of reality, forcing it to disappear into the non-delirious discourse of reason. What we have here is a minute rehearsal, at once theatrical and medical, of esse est percepi, to be is to be perceived. Its philosophical meaning is followed to the letter, and yet it is used in the opposite sense to its natural direction. It beats against the current of its own meaning. From the moment when delirium penetrates the field of percepi, the perceived, then, despite itself, it becomes a part of being, i.e., it enters into contradiction with its own being, which is non-esse, non-being. The theatrical therapeutic game which is then played out consists of harmonizing inside the delirium the demands of this particular being with the laws of being, the moment of the theatrical invention, the setting up of the comic illusion, the promoting between the two the tension and contradiction which are already inscribed there and which soon cease to be silent, the moment of the drama, and finally unveiling and bringing out into the cruel light of day the truth that the laws of being of delirium are nothing more than the appetites and desires of an illusion, the demands of non-being, and consequently that the percepi, the being perceived, which gave it its being, already secretly contained the seeds of its ruin. The comedy and the denouement. a denouement in the strict sense that being and non-being are freed of the confusion they suffer in the quasi-reality of delirium and are returned to the poverty of their true nature. Discernible here is a curious structural analogy during the classical age between different modes of liberation in the artifice of medical techniques and the serious games of theatrical illusions. They share the same equilibrium and the same movement. It can now be understood why madness as such disappeared from the theater at the end of the 17th century, to reappear only in the final years of the century that followed. The theater of madness was effectively realized in medical practice, and its comic reduction was of the order of an everyday cure. The return to the immediate. As madness was an illusion, the cure for madness, if it could be truly effected by the theater, could also be brought about by even more direct means, through the suppression of theater, directly entrusting the vain world of madness to the plenitude of nature, which never lies as its immediacy knows not non-being, meant giving madness over both to its own truth, since madness, as a form of sickness, was indeed a natural being, and to its closest contradiction, since delirium, as appearance without content, was also the opposite of the abundance, often secret and invisible, of nature. Nature thus appeared to be the reason of unreason, in the double sense that it both contained its causes and simultaneously concealed the principle of its suppression. It should be noted that these themes are not in evidence throughout the classical age. Although they follow the same experience of unreason, they take up where the theme of theatrical enactment left off, and their appearance indicates a moment when the interrogation of being and the lore begins to cede its place to problematics of nature. The games of theatrical illusion lose their meaning, and the artful technique of imaginary realization are placed by the simple, more ingenious art of a natural reduction. But this replacement has an ambiguous sense, as it is both a reduction through nature and a reduction to nature. The return to immediacy is the therapeutics par excellence, because it is the rigorous refusal of therapeutics and brings a cure in that it is a forgetting of all treatments. It is in the passivity of man with regard to himself and the silence that he imposes on his art and artifice that nature unveils in activity that is the exact reciprocal of the renunciation. On close examination, man's passivity is revealed to be a genuine activity. When men take medication, they elude the law of work that nature imposes upon them, sliding into the world of artifice and counter nature, of which madness is but one manifestation, and it was in ignoring sickness and retaking their place amongst the activity of natural beings that men, in apparent passivity, which at bottom was in industrious fidelity, could finally be cured.